Hello, students. So, today, as we start our discussion about our course about contemporary world, let us try to find out why do we consume these foods? Why do we go to fast food such as Jollibee and McDo? Why do we subscribe on these subscriptions? Like, for example, Netflix, and why do we buy items on Mobile Legends or skin on Mobile Legends or items in Dota? Or have you ever asked yourself, why do you buy 100 bucks of coffee or a 2000 bucks of planner in Starbucks? Or patronize Apple products such as iPhone, iWatch, MacBook, and those tablets? Why do Jinky Pacquiao and Heart Evangelista spend millions just for a bicycle and a bag? This is because we are living in a contemporary world. Contemporary world means that this is the modern world we are living, the current world that we are celebrating. So, as we discuss contemporary world, we better understand these topics. These two topics here are global age and globalization. What does it mean, global age? When we say global age, we try to see a period of time. And we believe in the contemporary world that the world is aging. According to its definition, it is a period of time when there is a prevailing sense of interconnectedness of all human beings, of common fate for human species, and a threat to its life on this earth. So let us go back with the definition about global age, meaning to say this tells us that this is a period of time where human beings are interconnected with each other, despite that we are not living in the same roof, despite that we're not living in the same country, we are still connected with one culture, one tradition, and one common faith, and that is for survival of human species. These two topics here are global age and globalization. What does it mean? Yes, we know already what is global age. Therefore, let us try to analyze what is happening in the global age, and that is globalization. Wow, this is quite a very lengthy definition of globalization. But let us try to dissect the definition of globalization. Since we all know that we are now currently experiencing the age which we call as the global age, therefore, we have to better understand what is happening during global age, and that is globalization, of which it is a process of interaction and integration among people, companies, and government of different nations. So that's it. That's the first definition. Of which, take note, it is a process, meaning to say it's a step to step process. You cannot jump from step 1 to step 5 while the others are left behind. Meaning to say, it goes along with a process, it goes along with the specific steps in achieving globalization. And this process involves two things: the interaction and integration, meaning to say, people, companies, and government interact with each other despite of their differences and similarities. They interact, and thus, if their interaction is good or bad, they are now being integrated as one. Okay. And another definition, it is a process driven by international trade and investment and aided by information technology. So, When we discuss globalization, we discuss about economic globalization. On our succeeding discussion, you will learn that the main tool or the main drive of globalization is economic globalization. So, part of it is international trade and investment, and aided with information technology or the technology we are experiencing today. Another is it discuss here the process has its effects. We believe that all of the things we do on earth has effects, whether it is good or bad, positive or negative, or advantage or disadvantage. All of the things in earth has effects. So, what are these effects? Effects on the environment, on culture, on political systems, on economic development and prosperity, and on human physical well being in societies around the world. Take note, one of the effects is in environment. A very good example of it is having climate change today. On culture, we try to adopt different cultures, like, for example, the adaptation of us loving K pop or loving Korean dramas and loving Korean pop music or pop culture or Korean culture today. So that's one of the example of globalization. And let us try to take note about globalization is. First, it is about liberalization and global integration of market. Take note that we discussed that one major drive of globalization is economics, and that's why we are trying to look on the market system, meaning to say liberalization. When we are talking about liberalization, it talks about freedom to choose, freedom to have businesses. So that's it. That's globalization. Next is globalization is inevitable and irreversible. When we are talking about inevitable and irreversible, meaning to say we cannot erase, we cannot vanish globalization because globalization is here. We cannot go back to the time. Like, for example, we can no longer go back to the pre-Hispanic age or even on the Renaissance or even on the medieval age of the world. We have to face globalization. Next is nobody is in charge of globalization. You, me, and us is never in charge of making globalization. We are just here as one of the tools that drives globalization itself. We are just here as part of the process of globalization. Next is benefits everyone in the long run. You and me, us, human race and human species benefits as being part of the process of of globalization. Yes, the benefit may be an advantage or a disadvantage to others, but let us try to look on a brighter side that globalization benefits all of us. Next is the further spread of democracy in the world. Going back to your social science, democracy talks about the majority rule, or meaning to say, the majority rule must prevail and the minority must be protected. So, if it is democracy, therefore, when we try to go on the process of globalization, therefore, we try to spread the majority rule, or what we call as the sonum bonum, or the good for all. That's sonum bonum. And lastly, globalization requires a global war on terror, which means that when we engage on the process, it deals a war. War because we try to change the current situation or the current status quo we are living. So that's it. That's globalization. I hope you have better understanding about globalization. If you have questions, feel free to ask on our next session. Now, let's move forward. These two topics here are global age and globalization. What does it mean in contemporary world? Contemporary world means that this is the modern world we are living, the current world that we are celebrating. So, as we discuss contemporary world, we better understand these topics. On conceptualizing what is globalization. So later, we will understand on the definition of Ritzer, of which it is a transplanetary process or processes involve increasing liquidity and growing multi-directional flows, as well as the structures they encounter and create. That's according to Ritzer. Let's try to analyze it later, the underlined words. Now, let us go first on conceptualizing how did we deal with the process of globalization. There are three processes to consider in understanding globalization. First is creating people, creating what we call as transnational. What does it mean by transnational? These are individuals. This is me, this is you, creating transnational of which we possess and we interconnect with each other despite of our differences in culture, tradition, language, and many others. So we created individuals. Now we transformed these individuals and we created social groups or communities. Therefore, we created now transnationality, which is the rise of new communities that creates new social identities in our today's world. So that's it. Upon creating a new community, we create now new social condition. Meaning to say, we create now a new social community, new norm, new culture, new tradition, of which we call it as globality. Or it is an omnipresence to the process of globalization, or this is the product of globalization. All right. So that's it, the process. We create people and we create transnational. Therefore, as we create people, we create communities, and that is transnationality. And lastly, as we create community, we create now a social condition which we call as globality or the product of globalization. Contemporary world. Contemporary world means that this is the modern world we are living, the current world that we are celebrating. So, as we discuss contemporary world, we better understand these topics. So, as Ritzer's definition as an increasing liquidity and multi-directional flows as a definition of globalization, to better understand it, we use metaphors. Going back to your English, we used figurative language as a substitute to words or definitions of things, like simile, hyperbole, and many others. So, let's try to deeper our understanding about metaphors. So, first is solidity. We use solidity as what? As to describe a limited mobility of people, things, information, and places over time. Going back to your chemistry, when we say solid, the atoms are compact and cannot easily moved, or it has limited mobility. Like in our globalization, in the contemporary world, solidity meaning to say we have limited mobility because we call it, there is what we call as barriers. Barriers later will be discussed. Contrary to solidity is liquidity. It's an increased ease of movement of people, things, information, and places in the global age. Meaning to say, going back to your chemistry again, when we say liquids, atoms are free flowing. Therefore, they free from any directions. That's liquidity. So, here in contemporary world, liquidity means we are the people, not the atoms, but people, things, information, and places has an increase and free flowing. All right? Another metaphor is heavy. When when therefore it hardens or there is a limited move, and if it is heavy, we have difficulty to move. And if it's difficult to move, therefore it is heavy. Like for example, if you're carrying a very tons of load, therefore it is heavy for you to move. Contrary to it is easier to move, meaning to say, if it is easy, if if we don't have any burdens or barriers at all when we are moving, therefore it is easier to move and it is what they call as light. So upon moving to solid to liquid, heavy to light, there is what we call as flow. The movement of people, things, information, and due to the what? Porosity of global barriers. So there are barriers of which flows affects. Later, we will know what are these barriers. So take note that globalization flows from solid to liquid, from heavy to light. So that's the movement of globalization. To better understand the movement or the flow of globalization, let us try to look at on this illustration below. Looking to the illustration below on your right, on your left rather, this is the evolution of communication. As you can see, we have a hardened we have a hard time. There is there is a limited mobility of communication before. Looking back, if you would like to communicate before, you have to burn woods and to create smoke to signal one community to the other that a you have a message for them. Thus, we use dove. So it transformed, and we use dove or crows or birds to deliver our message to a specific person or to specific groups. However, as time goes by, we changed that one and we created computers. Computers that delivers our message to the other person with just one click. Because of a very bulky computers, we turned it down into laptops. Laptops that are easier and handy for all of us to send message. And as we flow with globalization, we turned laptops to mobile phones. Mobile phones that as an easy as one click, we could send message, we could record, we could have cameras on your mobile phones as easy as that. So that's it. As you can see, the flow of globalization from a, from a solid or a limited mobility, we transform it with an increased movement of communication. Now, as you can see in the next figure, you could see how we write our letters. Before, we used it as a handwritten. So, we created and we improvised by creating typewriters. We typewrite our letters and then send it to post mails. However, we change it now with by the use of our computers and our laptops. We try to put it on a Word, then try to print it and deliver it to a person. However, we change it now by the use of our tablets and our phones. Just by a click of a hand, a minute, the person will receive your message. So that's it. That's how globalization turned to become one of the succeeding influence of today, contemporary world. Contemporary world means that this is the modern world we are living, the current world that we are celebrating. So, as we discuss contemporary world, we better understand these topics. So, we have discussed that one drive of globalization is economic globalization. So, what does it mean by economic globalization? It is a growing economic linkages at global level, meaning to say that since we are experiencing economic globalization, we are experiencing an economic linkages in a global level. We link from one country to the other, one state to the other in terms of economy. The global capitalist system has produced a very uneven playing field. Why does it we produce a very uneven playing field? Because we produce an even playing field because we we try to make social classes, right? We try to make this one, the Great Wall of China, to the huge digital divide in the world today. So, from from this one, from the from the Great Wall of China to the digital divide happening today. Take note that before we were divided because of Great Wall of China. That's why China was being isolated before as being ostracized as one of the countries in the world. However, today we are divided digitally. That some of the countries can afford to have online classes and some of the poorer countries cannot afford online classes. They have the hard time to do that. So why mobilizing technology today is a very difficult one, not just for you, not just for me, but for all of us third world countries. Now, we have discussed a while ago with barriers. What are these barriers? We have structural barriers, meaning to say, these are barriers embedded on our societies. And these are, first, social classes, meaning to say, we are divided because we are poor, because we are middle class, because they are rich. That's a barrier for all of us, right? Kung pobre ka, lisod jud kamo, lisod kamo, dato, because there are a lot seeking for it. And upper classes tend not to go back to poor. That's one of the barriers that is happening today. That's why there is a saying in political science that the the rich becomes richer and the poor becomes poorer. It's the social classes. Next structural barrier is race. We all know that despite that we fight for equality and equity, we still we still have racial discrimination. Discrimination not just of our race but for our colors. Like for example, if there are blacks, we tend to discriminate because we are blacks. We're never been contented of being white or being morena. We still we still discriminate them based of their color, based of their race. Like for example, why we still have to label? Why do media still label? Um, like for example, isa ka Muslim na kapatay. Why do we need to label those things? Well, in fact, we could we could just say that one person killed somebody, right? Parehas atong isa ka news sa Cagayan de Oro of which isolate ang isa ka Bajau community. Why do we need to label this community as Bajau community? Just to flame or just to put some fire on discrimination on Bajau. So that's it. Another structural barrier is ethnicity, meaning to say, like race, we tend to discriminate or we tend to look down On others, it's ethnicity. Like if you are a Manobo, if you are this and that, if you come from this tribe, why do we need to discriminate, or why do we need to look down on this? If we believe that we are all equals. Next is gender. Today it's a very hot topic that do we necessarily need to have gender equality, right? The equivalence of men and women and other genders, right? So it's a very long topic and we will be discussing that one sooner. Next is the region of the world, the division of the world, the north and the south divides. So one of the topics that we will be discussing is this one, the division of the world. And lastly, as part of economic globalization, as one of the product is this one. As you can see, people tend to go farther. Your American dream, as they call it, right? Your American dream, as you call it. So it happens here, the brain drain. Due to economic globalization, we tend to have brain drains in the country. Why? Those good person, or those excellent, those smart people around the world or in our countries tend to go to the other countries and try to work there because there's no work available here in our country, and tend to we and tend and we had and we became brain drains. That's why, as you can see in the picture, natin mga maayo nga mga doctors, mga scientists, but the government don't see it as an asset, rather as liability. That's why they go to other places and they find their luck there, as they see their luck and as they see that that opportunity. So that's it. That's what we call as brain drain. Contemporary world. Contemporary world means that this is the modern world we are living, the current world that we are celebrating. So, as we discuss contemporary world, we better understand these topics. Now, to better understand about globalization, we have to better understand about the origins and history of globalization. There are four origins and history of globalization. And together, let's try to see the recent changes that happened in globalization. First, in the origins and history of globalization is globalization, which we call as hardwire theory, or the urge. Meaning to say, when we are talking about, there are many perspectives, right, of origins of globalization. Where do globalization started? First is there is one theory or one perspective, and that is what they call as hardwire. When we say hardwired, simple. It's the urge for a better life. Meaning to say that globalization stems on the urge of human being of having a good life. Looking on this example, it seems like a Darwin's evolution. However, this is an evolution of communication again. Since we have the hard time to get news and communication from newspaper, we tend to innovate and create radios. And after radios, we want to see visual news. That's why we created televisions. And since televisions becomes one of our assets, tends to have the creation of laptops and computers. And now, with just one click of your hand, by the use of your cell phones, you could have your news at your hands. That's why delikado karon ang mga newspaper industries, because some of us are not using already newspapers. We use already the click of our phones. So that's it. That's hardwired. The origin of globalization started with the urge of human beings for a better life. That's why when when we tend we tend to go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we tend to have that human beings have endless needs and wants. That's why we created and we innovated more and more and more. That's why we still, like for example, one of it is your beauty products. Why is it nga sige man ta og palit og beauty products? Because there is an urge to have a better skin, to become more beautiful. That's why that is what we call as hardwired theory. Now, to better understand about globalization, we have to better understand about the origins and history of globalization. There are four origins and history of globalization. And together, let's try to see the recent changes that happened in globalization. Now, the next example is cycle. The origins, another perspective aside from hardwired, is cycle. Meaning to say, from the word itself, cycle, that there's no such thing as start and finish line of globalization. That globalization cycles from one stage to the other. Meaning to say, gatuyok-tuyok lang ang globalization. Like for example, we've come to this point and we are going back to that point. Like for example, on your fashion, we tend to have those kind of dresses before, and now we change it. We change because that dictates the call of time. However, we change that one from, and we try to go back to what we used to do on globalization, right? So that's cycle, meaning to say that there's no finish or start on globalization. Now, to better understand about globalization, we have to better understand about the origins and history of globalization. There are four origins and history of globalization. And together, let's try to see the recent changes that happened in globalization. Another perspective is epochs and origins. I believe all of you have answered the question I gave you, that if you could change one epoch or event in history, what would it be and why? Thus, according to Ritzer, there are six great epochs or waves of globalizations. These are first, in the 14th and 17th century, which witnessed the globalization of religions. Meaning to say that there is what we call as this is what we call as the medieval period. The medieval period or the medieval wave of the world, which we discover Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Protestantism, and many other kinds of religion. The globalization of religion. However, it changes during the 15th century when we highlighted the European colonial conquest, meaning to say the start of the great European conquest of what? Unsa man nilang gusto? Unsa man nilang gusto, sir? Unsa may gusto day sa European nga na gusto sila? Accordingly to our books, they need spices, right? However, according to history, they need three things. They call it as the three G's. Meaning to say three G's, take note. They they colonialize countries because of three G's. First is that is God. Meaning to say God, they means as they want to spread Christianity around the world. So that's it. Second is gold. What does it mean by gold? Kanibang gold nga kuan? Not that one. The gold they're talking is spices. Spices of which, if they could get more spices, that's the gold for them. And the third one is glory. The more countries they colonize, they are more glorified. Meaning to say, if they conquered one country to the other, therefore, they means they are the most powerful country. So again, three things that the European colonial conquest: the God, gold, and glory. Okay? So, as the change of colonial conquest, we have here the late 18th and 19th centuries during the various intra-European wars led to globalization. Do you know this person? This person is one of the great warriors of Europe, and that is Napoleon Bonaparte. He conquered many places and thus created one of the glories of Rome. Now, since since this is the 18th centuries have intra-European wars, they don't already gained the three Gs. They want wars. As they go along with different places, they engage with wars. If madaog sila, because if madaog sila, they would get that place and therefore they will be glorified. Okay? And it changes in the mid 19th century to 18th century, the heyday of Rome. Meaning to say, the heyday of European imperialism. Meaning to say, they have almost conquered the world. They have they have conquered many of the Asian countries such as Singapore by the Great Britain, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia by the Spain, and many others. So the heyday of Rome. So that's it. And lastly is the post-World War period. So as you can see, this is Churchill and many great leaders of the World War II period. So that's it. That's the great epochs of the world period. And lastly is the post-Cold War period. When we say Cold War period, this is the period of time which dili gaaway of guns and bullets, but they engage in war of technologies and they engage in war of knowledge and learnings. That's why if you're familiar with Neil Armstrong, it arises there as the first man in the moon. Ingon sila, right? So, mo na sa US, pero wa po nagpalupig ang Soviet Union or Russia. Ingon po sila, no, we are. We are the first one to step down on the moon. So that is what we call as Cold War. Dili sila gaaway sa mga weapons, but they engage war based on their knowledge and their technologies. Okay? Now, that's the epochs of Now, to better understand about globalization, we have to better understand about the origins and history of globalization. There are four origins and history of globalization. And together, let's try to see the recent changes that happened in globalization. Let us try to go to the recent changes. The events in history are many others, and one of which will be discussed on our succeeding topics. Now, let's try to understand the recent changes that happened to globalization. First is the emergence of the United States as a global power in the years following World War II. Meaning to say, after World War II, the dominant country that that holds power is US. That's why we all know and we emerge the Captain America. So we will try to analyze the movie Captain America and Superman to be exact. Next is the emergence of multinational corporations or MNCs or transnational corporations such as this picture below. So, the rise of the different corporations around the world. And lastly is the demise of Soviet Union and the end of Cold War, meaning to say the disintegration of Soviet Union or ang pagbuak-buak sa Soviet Union and created with many countries such as Russia and many others. And the end of Cold War. We have discussed already what is Cold War. Okay? So that's the recent changes. And these recent changes will be discussed further on our succeeding topics. So that's it. That's what we call as the first chapter of the definition of globalization. I hope you have understand some of it and you would really read and understand all of those. Okay? If you have questions, feel free to ask those questions sooner or later as we meet virtually. Okay? So for the moment, you have to listen and you have to understand on this video. Thank you so much and I hope you're doing good. God bless everyone. Now, to better understand about globalization, we have to better understand about the origins and history of globalization. There are four origins and history of globalization. And together, let's try to see the recent changes that happened in globalization. Contemporary world. Contemporary world means that this is the modern world we are living, the current world that we are celebrating. So, as we discuss contemporary world, we better understand these topics.